Welcome to the 100th episode of the Mongabay Newscast. It's August 4th, 2020, and I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. That's right, folks. This is the 100th episode of the Mongabay Newscast. We launched this podcast all the way back in September of 2016. And just like with our parent site, Mongabay.com, our chief goal has always been to report on what works and what doesn't in conservation. To discern how successful conservation strategies are at achieving their goals, we need data and research into their impacts. But as it turns out, impact evaluations have not traditionally been a major part of conservation interventions deployed around the world, though that is perhaps starting to change, as we'll see. In 2017, Mongabay launched a project called Conservation Effectiveness that aimed to look at what kind of evidence we had for what works in conservation. So on today's 100th episode of the newscast, we're revisiting the Conservation Effectiveness Project in order to see what developments there have been since we did the initial reporting 3 years ago. Joining us today are Mongabay founder and CEO Rhett Butler, who tells us about the impetus for the series of reports that would become Conservation Effectiveness, what the main findings were from the project, and how much new evidence has been produced for the impact of various conservation strategies in the intervening years. We also speak with Sven Wunder, a principal scientist at the European Forest Institute in Barcelona, Spain, as well as a senior associate at the Center for International Forestry Research, or CIFOR. Wunder actually spoke with me for the piece I wrote about payments for ecosystem services and the evidence we have for its effectiveness as a conservation intervention back in 2017 as part of the Conservation Effectiveness series. And we've spoken again for this episode of the podcast, so he can fill us in on the latest research into the impact of a variety of conservation strategies. The Conservation Effectiveness Project was a collaboration between former Mongabay staff writer Shreya Dasgupta, tropical forest ecologist Zuzana Buravilova, and myself. Shreya and I did the reporting, and Zuzana did the research into the body of evidence for the impacts achieved by a number of conservation intervention types, like forest certification, protected areas, community-based forest management, and, as already mentioned, payments for ecosystem services, or PES. What we found for pretty much all of these intervention types was that there was not an abundance of research on their effectiveness, and many of the studies that had been done were not rigorously designed. Here's Mongabay's Rhett Butler on why he put the Conservation Effectiveness Project together back in 2017.
The reason for starting the Conservation Effectiveness series was really my frustration from not having good answers when people came to me and said, okay, well, what's the best intervention to support? And sort of, you have kind of your gut, but it's always nice to be able to point to a definitive study or whatnot. So I thought, well, it could be really interesting to dig into this as a topic. And so, the reason that conservation effectiveness is important is funding is a limiting factor in conservation. So as such, there's a lot of competition for what are scarce resources. So it's important to put money towards interventions that actually work. After doing the series, I think the biggest takeaway for me was how poor the academic literature is for trying to actually evaluate conservation effectiveness. In the series, we got into a bunch of the reasons for this. I mean, just for example, lack of inclusiveness and diversity is an important factor. But one of the issues is a lack of good data that can be used to directly compare conservation outcomes.
One major barrier to evaluating outcomes of conservation projects is that you need some kind of counterfactual to compare the project to. For instance, if you want to measure the impacts of a protected area, the best way to do so would be to have an equally large plot of land that is similar in all respects to the protected area, but that is not protected, allowing you to determine how well the protections put in place for the experimental plot did compared to the unprotected control plot. That's not really feasible when you're talking about conserving whole landscapes, but with large amounts of data from different landscapes and intervention types, you might be able to start making some general conclusions to which you can compare any particular intervention. Yet most conservation projects are not set up to capture and report this kind of data.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly an issue. So, and as to why that is, I think one of the fundamental problems is that a lot of the funding that goes into this space isn't long-term enough to design research that really gets to the heart of evaluating conservation effectiveness.
It probably goes without saying, but there are a number of reasons why it's important for us to understand how well conservation interventions are actually working.
One reason why it's important to research what works and what doesn't work in conservation is you don't want to be putting money into interventions that don't work or actually undermine your objectives. So you don't want to increase the amount of harm. Ultimately, you're trying to understand, where you should be investing money and how you can really evaluate, what the impacts are of those resources. So, just for example, you don't want to be putting money into something that's a black hole and just support it because there's inertia for supporting it. So, I think one of the things that emerged from this project was a lot of environmental groups weren't very transparent about how they were spending money. So they would establish a program, and because the program existed, that program would receive money regardless of sort of what the outcomes were of that work. So there's sort of a hesitancy to step back and say, like, okay, does this work or not work? And if it doesn't work, can we fix it? And so one of the important initiatives that's emerged in the past couple of years since the Conservation Effectiveness Project is called the Fail Factors Initiative. And so this is being headed up by WCS.
That's the Wildlife Conservation Society, of course.
And the basic premise is to encourage learning from failures in conservation. So again, this is a common problem in just the nonprofit sector generally, but people don't really like to talk about failure. You just want to highlight success stories. But if you don't highlight failure, then no one learns from it. And so people will repeat the same things that don't work. And so it's a simple idea, but it's a very important initiative to start to document what those failures are so the conservation sector can learn from them.
Another barrier to doing more evaluations of conservation impacts is that most conservation donors want their money going to work directly to protect things like wildlife and forests.
Yeah, I think one of the big hurdles in terms of funding is exactly that. So funders want their money going to work on the ground, not going to evaluation generally. And evaluation is not easy. So it requires a lot of resources. And so if a funder's, asked to choose, then they're probably going to prioritize the work on the ground. And I think, again, that's true with a lot of sectors, but we just see it very commonly in conservation as being a major issue. So part of the direction has to come from funders being willing to commit resources to doing that evaluation. And I do think that's happening. There are a number of new initiatives in this general vein, which are trying to evaluate or provide more data that can be used to evaluate conservation effectiveness. So that's been really interesting to see over the past 3 years.
Butler already mentioned the WCS program to document conservation failures so that future projects can learn from them, and he feels this is emblematic of the growing recognition of the need for more rigorous impact evaluations.
Yeah, I think so. So, there are a couple new initiatives like Evidencia, which is from the Rainforest Alliance and WWF, and then like the FSC Research Portal, which were directly inspired by the methodology developed by Dr. Zuzana Borivalova, who led the conservation effectiveness project for Mongabay. Beyond that, there's like the University of Oxford's nature-based solutions evidence platform, which is gathering this data. Beyond that, there's a whole bunch of other ones. But one of the, I guess, byproducts of conservation effectiveness was the development of a paper on bioacoustics. So bioacoustics is an area where there could be a lot of data that could be used for evaluating the effectiveness of conservation projects. So, just to take a little bit step back. So bioacoustics is looking at the sounds of wildlife in an ecosystem and then using those sounds for biodiversity monitoring. Zuzana Borivalova, myself, and Eddie Game from TNC,
or the Nature Conservancy,
published this paper in Science back in January 2019. That paper argued that essentially to address one of these core conclusions from the Conservation Effectiveness Project, which was the lack of adequate data for really doing this evaluation of conservation outcomes, we needed more data. The paper argued that bioacoustics could be used for a number of outcomes from biodiversity monitoring at scale to strengthening zero deforestation commitments, which are a type of conservation intervention, to providing a mechanism for looking at the effectiveness of specific conservation projects and interventions. So our hope is that the paper would raise the visibility for everyone working on bioacoustics, which is a growing field. And since then, we've seen a huge surge in awareness around bioacoustics, and that data is starting to flow into these sort of evaluation systems, which could be really useful for informing financial flows into conservation projects as well as project design.
As you know, Rhett, we've featured a number of bioacoustic recordings and research informed by bioacoustics here on the Mongabay Newscast. Back in 2017, we even had Dr. Zuzana Buravilova on the program to play us some of the more than 100 soundscapes she's recorded in a variety of habitat types in Indonesian Borneo, and to tell us how those recordings are used to monitor wildlife populations. So I'd love to hear more about the general lack of data for conservation impact evaluations and how bioacoustics might plug that gap.
Yeah, so a lot of the assessment of trends in biodiversity is based off proxy data, so maybe based off of sampling or camera traps or something like that. The problem is that camera traps are really spatially limited, so it requires an animal to pass in front of the camera trap and then to make extrapolations based off that data. But it's only giving you a very limited slice of what's actually happening in a forest. Bioacoustics give you a much broader range of data. So essentially, any animal, and that can be anything from an insect to a frog to a bird to a mammal that makes sound, that has calls, you can collect that data at scale. And so if you can bring that into a centralized system and then analyze that data, it can tell you a lot about the health of the ecosystem, how the eco responds to disruptions or change, and also just about the community members of the ecosystem. So from that standpoint, you can establish baselines to compare geographies, different conservation interventions, even different groups. So you could say, look at a payments for ecosystem services project, let's say in Borneo, and see what the biodiversity levels are, and then compare that to say like a community managed project in an indigenous forest and see what the biodiversity levels are there. You could also compare it to say like a selective logging project. Or if you have a reforestation project, you can actually evaluate how quickly biodiversity is recovering relative to say like an intact forest. So you could say like, okay, well, we're now at like 30% of what this intact forest is based on this bioacoustic data. So there's just a lot you can do with that goes beyond just say looking at camera trap images or satellite imagery of tree cover. So it just provides more nuance into what's actually happening with animals themselves. So going beyond, just trees or some charismatic animals that might pass in front of a camera trap.
As Butler mentioned, bioacoustics is still a growing field, but there are groups working on deploying acoustic recorders to produce the kinds of large-scale data needed to inform conservation effectiveness research.
So a lot of researchers have been using bioacoustics as a way to support their research for quite a long time. So it's not a new idea, but the real value kind of comes in aggregating that data into a centralized system and making it available so people know what's there. And so there are some efforts to make this data more available. And I think probably one of the most exciting ones is being run by a group called Rainforest Connection. And they're really trying to build a platform that aggregates data often in real time and would be a place where you could run algorithms against, say, like a gibbon or something like that, and see patterns of gibbon activity across different geographies and ecosystems. So I would say within the next decade, there's going to be some really interesting work in this space. And I also think that the cost of deploying these types of systems is dramatically falling. So there should be an expansion in the number of places where devices are being deployed because it's cheaper. And then I think there's also going to be better internet connectivity. So there may be situations where you won't necessarily have to collect data by going out to the field and picking up the cards. You can actually just have it stream to a centralized network, via satellite and mobile connections.
How is the COVID pandemic affecting this movement towards greater evaluation of conservation effectiveness?
So COVID has had incredible and wide-ranging impacts throughout the conservation sector. So this manifests, from reduced funding to the collapse of ecotourism to the abandonment of projects. But it also represents a potential opportunity to rethink conservation practice and look at alternative development pathways. So not only like in the conservation space, so to move away from sort of failing business as usual approaches, but also more broadly, what is humanity's relationship with the world around us? So this might be, low carbon development pathways, people getting used to there being clean air. So when we go back to how things were, people may not be happy with that. And, so there's going to be opportunities to change the way things are. And so from that standpoint, it's going to be really critical to understand what actually works and what doesn't work in conservation, because we're going to need to inform the decisions that underpin, how we go about maintaining tree cover or increasing tree cover or reducing the likelihood of pandemics emerging from human wildlife interactions or say the wildlife trade. So from that standpoint, I see conservation effectiveness becoming more important, not less important, in a COVID or post-COVID era.
Also relevant in the COVID era, I would think, is something like One Health, a transdisciplinary approach to achieving beneficial health outcomes by recognizing that the health of people, animals, plants, and our shared environments are all interconnected.
Yeah, One Health is a great example. So One Health really makes conservation relevant to larger audiences by showing how healthy and productive ecosystems directly impact human well-being. And so one of the byproducts of the Conservation Effectiveness series was an initiative called Transforming Conservation, which Mongabay launched with the Malia Silly initiative to bring together people to discuss the structural issues that have led conservation to stagnate relative to other sectors like poverty alleviation, healthcare, and education. So that platform brought together some of the best minds in conservation and design thinking to explore opportunities and identify leverage points for transforming conservation practice to make it more efficient and impactful. And as part of that process, it really looked at, what are these structural issues? And one of those was conservation tends to be put in a silo. So rather than seeing it as something that underpins, human well-being and the ecosystems that sustain us, it's seen as being sort of a very niche issue. And so a key way to advancing conservation is to really broaden the relevance so the average person understands why it's important to protect the Amazon rainforest, things like that. And so One Health is exactly in that space because it makes that connection between our current relationship with nature and wildlife to our everyday lives.
This is why the Conservation Effectiveness reporting series we did not only looked at the evidence for how well conservation interventions are achieving environmental goals, but also social and economic goals for local communities. Issues like public health and poverty can have an outsized impact on the success or failure of a conservation effort.
Yeah, because if you have a conservation intervention that increases poverty, ultimately it's not going to be a successful intervention because you won't have the support of local people or the government to maintain that project. And actually, one of the really interesting things that I've observed over, I would say it's probably the last 10 years, has been the increased awareness around the effectiveness of securing land tenure for indigenous peoples as a conservation intervention. So 10 years ago, you didn't hear that much about that. Now it's seen as one of the most effective ways to protect forest is to recognize the traditional land rights and tenureship of people who actually live in forests.
So evidence for their effectiveness notwithstanding, what do you think of some of the other more promising conservation interventions being widely deployed today?
That's a good question. I think fundamentally, one of the critical things is ensuring that conservation projects drive benefits for local people who live in and around those ecosystems. So one of my favorite projects in the world links forest protection with healthcare directly. And so this is Project ASRI, or Health and Harmony's initiative in Borneo, but now expanded to other places, where high quality healthcare is delivered to communities in need. And there are additional benefits that come in terms of reduced costs to healthcare if a community agrees to not illegally log the national park. And so, I mean, the basic premise is there's an incentive being provided to maintain that forest cover.
If you want to hear more about Health and Harmony's healthcare for conservation model, you can hear the group's founder, Kanari Webb, discuss it in an April 2019 episode of this very podcast.
And I think that concept is spreading more widely. I mean, it's a very simple concept, but it makes sense that if people benefit directly from maintaining an ecosystem, they'll be more likely to maintain it. And so, I think that's kind of cross-cutting. It hits a few different areas, but it's community-based conservation. I mean, there's even an element of payments for ecosystem services to a degree, but it's different than, say, like RED or something like that.
RED is the UN's Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation initiative.
So I would say, like, that's probably one of them, beyond recognizing land tenure, that's kind of one of the more promising interventions that seems to be gaining ground. Some of the more formalized payments for ecosystem services project initiatives, like RED Plus, I would say there's probably not been as much success as proponents of that initiative have hoped for in this period of time. Zero deforestation which is corporate commitments to eliminating deforestation from supply chains. There's a lot of hope for that in the early part of the 2010s, but it hasn't really been realized. It's been much harder to move from the commitment phase to the implementation phase. And so those commitments are still in the books, but we haven't seen the reductions in deforestation that one might have envisioned from the extent of commitments that were made, 5 or 10 years ago.
Okay, now we'll turn to part 2 of our 100th episode of the Mongabay Newscast and our conversation about developments since Mongabay's Conservation Effectiveness series was published in 2017. Our next guest, Sven Wunder, was one of the experts I spoke with about payments for ecosystem services, or PES, which is a conservation intervention that, to put it simply, involves paying local communities to safeguard their forest or other ecosystem in order to ensure the provision of some service provided by nature, such as clean water or carbon sequestration. I wanted to speak with Wunder for my article after reading a blog post he'd just written for C4 about something called Conservation Impact Evaluation 2.0.
It's cited from Professor Paul Ferraro, a good colleague and friend of mine, who's been working a lot on these impact evaluation issues, and it refers to a sort of a detailed assessment of impact evaluation of different tools. So often you have policy mixes being applied. You want to try to isolate the different impacts. You want to look at both welfare impacts and direct conservation impacts. So it simply refers to rigorous analysis carried out at a level of detail that allows you to do a good causal attribution of the impacts that you are after.
And how does Conservation Impact Evaluation 2.0 differ from 1.0, so to speak?
I think we're still in a phase of development of these methods, and often you would find only single bottom line results that are not going sort of the extra mile for trying to understand the full context of what has happened. And I think what it's all about is that you not give just a result in isolation, but you're trying to reconstruct a theory of change. That you have an intervention that had some intentions, that used some tools, etc., and you want to specify a series of outcomes from that. and you want to take into account that some effects might be heterogeneous in space or with different target groups, etc. So it's simply a greater level of sophistication of the analysis that allows you to be more informative about different parts of the theory of change of an intervention.
So it's essentially trying to account for the fact that every landscape, every ecosystem is different, and a different mix of policies and intervention types might be required for each of them?
Yes, that's certainly part of it. That context matters very much, so that you take different contexts better into account.
In that same blog post, Wunder also wrote about a study that had just been done in Mexico that compared protected areas to payments for ecosystem services, which he said lived up to the Conservation Impact Evaluation 2.0 standard.
I should say this study was done by Jennifer Alex Garcia and Kate Sims and their respective collaborators. Yes, they did. I think the key thing was to actually compare for one particular site the impact, or one particular country in this case, to compare the impacts of both tools, protected areas, and payments for environmental services. I don't see a lot of those studies that have appeared, but I think there's a greater consciousness in terms of isolating different impacts, and we've tried ourselves, for instance, recently done an impact evaluation study of the watershed PS scheme in Moyabamba in the Amazon part of Peru, and there we try to separate, what's the effect of command and control measures that have been applied, and on the other hand, on the incentive side, which includes a PES type of intervention. So there are some movements out there, but I think still far too often people are just analyzing the single thing that is of their interest. So
when we spoke in 2017, Wunder told me that he was generally an optimist about how well PES could work, and that the more results we get, the more evidence pointed to some areas where it can work to the benefit of the environment and people at the same time. I was curious if any subsequent research had come out that changed that opinion.
Yes, I think I'm still generally an optimist, and I think we generally often too quick to kind of abandon things. I think we're getting excited about initiatives, that are new, but then we often scrap them a little bit too early, because we underestimate, how long time it takes to actually get to do things well. And I think for PES, I think there is still quite a lot of enthusiasm sort of among people that are trying to implement it. I think part of the academic community has become a bit more lukewarm about it, also because it's not that new anymore. But we recently did a stock taking of a meta study type of a comparison of the impact evaluation literature results, where we looked at both the impacts from PES and those from other interventions, such as protected areas, such as integrated conservation and development projects, or land titling, etc. And we still lack a sort of a full picture we still don't have a huge amount of studies that would give us, a lot of statistical degrees of liberty to say, which ones are better performing than others, and what are the factors that are contributing to that. But what we can say is that PES is certainly in the upper end of in a comparison of impacts from different conservation tools. So that's encouraging. At the same time, we also know from from a detailed knowledge about different implementation schemes, that a lot of things could be done better. And since we talked last time in 2017, we've also been trying to with my collaborators to look more into what are the factors that are actually the design factors that are actually important. And there we found, in particular, in a study that was in 2018 was published in Nature Sustainability, we pointed to three different things. One is the spatial priorities, the spatial targeting. You often have threats in the landscape being quite unevenly distributed, and often you can predict where things are going to be more threatened. For instance, closeness to roads, closeness to markets, fertility of the soil, etc. So you would want to target those areas more, and for some environmental services, like for hydrological services, for instance, you also have very uneven returns. What are the areas where you really want to protect from erosion, etc.? There are typically some critical zones that are disproportionately important. So doing your analysis well there, and then being able to actually focus and maybe pay premiums or make sure that those land plots that are the most important enter the schemes. That is important. So that's one factor I would mention. Another one on the implementation side is a bit the way you are paying. I think we still see too often that sort of a uniform rate is being applied, when in fact we know that the conservation opportunity costs that we are trying to compensate for landowners varies quite a lot between them.
The opportunity costs for landowners refers to how much money they could make from other uses of their land. In order to entice landowners to enroll their land in a PES program, you generally have to pay them at least as much as they could have made through other, perhaps more destructive uses.
Again, the one who is directly near to the road it's a much higher cost for that landowner to not deforest or a profit foregone than for somebody who is sitting in a very remote plot. So you would, to be competitive, you would need to offer them different rates of payment to make it attractive to both of them. And then perhaps the third factor, and the one which might surprise a little bit, is the whole issue of implementing conditionality. What we found out in that study at the time was that more than half of these pest schemes have actually never applied any sanction. And we know from a lot of examples that if you are in a pest contract.
In case it's not clear, Wonder is saying PES instead of PES.
And you have 1,000 landowners under contract, then some of them will test the limits. Some of them will try to receive the money and still do what they would have done without a PES contract. And that creates a sort of a moral hazard kind of problem. And we know several schemes, where this sort of the sanctioning part, the enforcement of conditionality, has been on and off, and say it's important in order to be credible, because that's kind of the key defining mechanism of the PS scheme, is that you only pay when you get a certain environmental service, when you get a compliance with the land use behavior that is set out in the contract. And if you fail to actually implement sanctions, then often landowners will not take you seriously. They will know that probably you can get away with not complying or complying less and still getting paid. So that's important, and we found out also then, the first indications that that's an important factor for success or not, simply by looking at the self-stated by implementers or stated by external observers. does this scheme actually make a difference? Is it likely to cause an environmental additionality? Is it likely to increase the level of services provided? So we found already there, with a crude measure, at least some indication for that all of these three factors are likely to be important. What I really look forward to is, if we move forward, then maybe in 5 to 10 years, we would have enough of evaluation studies that do rigorous evaluation of these things using GIS measures and using accounting of forest areas conserved or not. That would allow us to in statistical analysis to sort of get back to an assessment of the importance of these factors. So we can say it really makes so much percentage of difference whether you are applying a solid spatial targeting measures or not. So that's what I see kind of also going into the future. There are lots of opportunities as more of these studies become available for us to get more sophisticated, and that's coming back to the 2.0 assessment of conservation impact assessment, that we can sort of learn more and more about what things make a difference for the outcomes of PES.
How does PES compare to protected areas in terms of its impact on environmental, social, and economic indicators? And how much data or evidence do we have for the effectiveness of protected areas as compared to PES?
In this article, we just did an assessment of a comparative assessment of the conservation impacts. And there we can find that we don't have a huge amount of observations, but actually PES come out as statistically a significantly higher impact of conservation than protected areas. But it is barely significant. So there's not a huge difference, but it is probably doing a little bit better. Now, as I said, within that group of pest schemes that have been applied and protected area schemes that have been applied, there is obviously also a large variance. It would be very interesting to also analyze the welfare impacts. My sense is that protected areas as such are trying to basically restrict access. In some cases, that will be it will create some benefit to those people who are already in those protected areas, if it's protected areas of a sustainable use type, where the human presence is allowed. But I think probably PES will also do a little bit better on the welfare side, because you actually giving people some money in their hand, which you're not doing directly with protected areas. So it's more of a designed as a proper incentive tool. So I would expect it to also have larger impacts. For the whole database of rigorous impact evaluations of conservation tools, we had 136 observations, and actually 82 of them are protected areas, and just 22 of them are PES. So it's almost 4 times the size of assessments for protected areas, which is not surprising in the way that protected areas have been around for a much longer time.
And what about even newer intervention types like securing land tenure for indigenous communities? Do we have much evidence for something like that?
Yes, we're also looking at that in this article with Jan Berner from the University of Bonn, also in the annual review of resource economics forthcoming in this December. And actually it comes out pretty high, but it's a story that is basically being driven by Brazil. And we did have, at least in the recent past, we had a pattern where indigenous lands were quite effectively protected. I think things have changed a little bit now under the Bolsonaro administration. But yes, it's Latin America. in part Colombia, etc. But it's in terms of impact evaluation, what we know is mostly from Brazil, and there it has been quite an effective tool. There have also been other assessments around the world, for instance, on areas burned. We also found that indigenous lands were doing quite well. So it seems that they can be a quite effective conservation tool, at least in line with the protected areas in general.
What other conservation intervention types are most promising and cost-effective based on the available evidence today?
So I would say the indigenous lands can be and other sustainable use areas. I mean, you have also the so-called RESECs, the extractive reserves in Brazil. They have also been quite effective in terms of conservation performance. And I think this type of tool works well when the predominant threat comes from outside, so that the inside people get your conservation allies. If there's a huge population density or huge population growth and an accelerating pace of itinerant / burn agriculture, for instance, then these things might work less well, because people will not be able to stick to the rules to the same extent. But otherwise, yes, on this particular list, we find that some of the integrated conservation development projects are actually doing quite well, but it's also very few observations, just 3 observations. Is similar with some decentralized forest management, decentralization as a strategy of local governance, etc. Does fairly well. I think all of these tools do well to some extent. Sort of last on the list here is sort of certification. It did not come out with a huge impact, and product certification. And I think my suspicion would be that often, it's a scheme of rewarding those producers that are already doing well. But it's harder to get an additionality where you drag in a huge number of new producers that were not compliant before that find that attractive. And also land titling and land reform comes out with a huge variance. And I think that makes good sense. We just have 4 different observations here, but it depends on what land titling is combined with, and land reform. Because having more secure land tenure on its own, it may help you to plan for the future conservation and sustainable use of your area, but it may also help you in terms of justifying the costs of converting all your forests to agricultural farmland, and then it's yours, and you can use it for the next many years. Something you might not do if you did not have secure tenure. So it's these enabling conditions. They can enable sustainable use, but they can also enable land conversion, and that could explain the more ambivalent character of the outcomes we find.
Do you think there's a general trend towards more rigorous evaluation of conservation effectiveness today, or is there still a great need to really ramp up these kinds of efforts?
I think there's still a great need, but we do also see certainly a movement in that direction. I think we can see that there's been an accelerating pace of new studies appearing on these things, and I think that is a good thing. I think we do need to take into account some of the caveats, some of the methodological twists there may be, because basically what you are doing is obviously constructing some counterfactual of what would have happened without that particular intervention, and that's always complicated, of finding the right counterfactual, the most probable one. And personally, I'm more a fan of looking at different scenarios, having more than one business as usual scenario that you are evaluating against, precisely because you don't know, and there can be different assumptions that you make So I like impact evaluation studies where you report a range of results rather than a point estimate.
What needs to happen over, say, the next decade to get us to where we are evaluating conservation impacts as rigorously as necessary?
I would hope that we get a much larger database on a much larger number of initiatives. I would also hope that the donors, the conservation donors, they start to see this as a plus for them, and also the proper conservation organizations. Often people are reluctant to let their project being evaluated because it might show that impacts were low or zero, and that may make it difficult for you to get funding for a prolongation of the next phase of your project, for instance. But I think it's healthy for us for the decision makers involved to actually take to impact evaluation as a tool that enlightens their decisions in terms of what to do, in terms of a willingness of actively to learn. So maybe when you start out a new project, you spend a little bit more money on a certain research component. And for instance, you randomize a certain part of the implementation in a way that allows you to look at impact more rigorously. That's a tool that is the randomization tool is also controversial, but at least to perhaps identify some control sites and say, all right, we are doing our intervention in this area here, but we want to look at a sister areas or various sister areas and also monitor development there in order for us to have a better picture of what has been the true impact of the things that we are doing here. So I hope that we are getting there. I can also see some limitations because often we have quite complex interventions on the ground that are being customized, over time. They're being combined between laws and law enforcement, and so command and control tools and sustainable development projects of the integrated type, and maybe some PS payments. So often when reality is so complex, you cannot effectively break it down sufficiently, especially when you have smaller projects where you simply, even if you interview everybody, you will not have the degrees of freedom statistically to actually say, this is what caused outcome A to underperform and outcome B to overperform. So it's something we should keep in mind. We can get better at this, and especially we should do so for the larger interventions, the big government programs, etc. But I think we should also recognize that it's probably not going to give us all the answers in the world that we would like to have, because implementation contexts and are just too variable. And when human and environmental systems meet in their variability, we can't explain exactly everything that we would like to know.
If you enjoy the Mongabay Newscast, we ask that you please consider becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet, so just $1 or more per month would really help us offset production costs and hosting fees. Supporters at the $10 a month level also get access to our members-only insider content. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, please head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay Newscast. That's patreon.com/Mongabay. And don't forget you can subscribe to the Mongabay Newscast on Android, the Google Podcasts app, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, RSS, CastBox, Pocket Casts, via Pandora or Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our new app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all our previous episodes. And of course, you can read all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/Mongabay or on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is @Mongabay on both of those platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Mongabay Newscast. I'm your host, Mike Recchi, signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.